Participants can now share.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, I'll go ahead and get us started. Hello, everyone. My name is Helen Chen. I'm a member of the AAEEBL board. Really delighted to welcome you today to our session on assessment, academic integrity and access, doing it right, digital ethics with ePortfolios. I'd like to invite our friend and colleague from ePortfolios Australia, Alison Miller, to also welcome you as well.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Kevin. Sorry, excuse me, I've got a croaky voice on. Yeah, very exciting again to work with AAEEBL. We've had an opportunity to work with AAEEBL over a number of years, but to be part of your month-long program is pretty exciting, and looking forward to having a very rigorous discussion again through this session.
So we'd like to start with just this ethical declaration, just to let you know that we are recording this session, as you saw from the very beginning. If you do not want what you write or say during this webinar to be used for our ongoing research in digital ethics and ePortfolios, please feel free to indicate so. You can send it through a private chat if you'd prefer, and we'll certainly respect your decisions and keep that in mind as we go forward with this work. As you know, like everything that is happening during this month is something that we're really trying to generate resources for our AAEEBL and broader ePortfolio community. So that is the reason for the recording and all of our ongoing efforts. All right, so in terms of giving an overview, let's see here. So I think I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Alison.
Thank you, Helen. So look, there's a lot of kind of background stuff that we want to share with people. So first of all, a little bit about the two groups, and then about how these conversations come about around digital ethics from the AAEEBL's perspective, but also from ePortfolios Australia, how that grew out of there. And then we've got some really interesting questions that each of the panelists will answer, and then our wonderful MCs will facilitate. And then we'd really like to have you think about at the end about where to from here. You've spent some time with us, you've learned some things, you've shared some things, and then what is it that you might do with it, this information and opportunity to connect with others. And then we'll share a little bit about some of the other ePortfolio community practice stuff that's happening both in North America and down under as well. And then Helen and Kevin will wrap up with a few thank yous. So we're really lucky to have, as you probably already know, some of you are already in the audience, lucky to have Helen lead the session today. So ideally you know a little bit about Helen's background. So I've worked with Helen for more than a decade now, I think, in terms of ePortfolios. And so she's obviously a leader in your area and very highly recognised down under as well. And then through this process, so we ran a session earlier this year, and through this process, I've been introduced to Kevin. So this is one of the wonderful things about being part of a broader community internationally. So I originally had Kevin painted as an academic, but I know he doesn't only work at the San Francisco State University. He's got many hats, and so he's a bit like myself. That's what I do. It keeps me out of mischief. And then I've also been able to work with Professor Patsy Polly. My first memory of Patsy is in WA here, in Western Australia here. I'm sure I had contact with her beforehand, but my very first memory of her is that she was a pretty powerful individual and very thought-provoking, and I think you'll find that you'll see that again today. And Patsy's based in Sydney at the University of New South Wales. So I think I hand it back to you now, Helen.
Great. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and ask Kevin, if you wouldn't mind, for the next two slides, telling us a little bit about AAEEBL as well as our plans for our month-long conference.
You bet. So the Association for Authentic, Experiential, and Evidence-Based Learning, or AAEEBL, the longest acronym spelled out in the history of organizations, is really meant to cover those broad strokes, but through often through a lens of electronic portfolios as a way to express that we have performed some sort of assessment activity or what have you with generating evidence of student learning and more. So the group has been around for a number of years, started by a fine gentleman named Trent Batson, and he has handed the baton to the board here that's trying its best to follow in his footsteps by creating value for the community. And so we do that in different ways, such as producing a field guide to ePortfolios, which was published in conjunction with AACNU. And as Helen mentioned, the AAEEBL ePortfolio Review, which is twice or 3 times a year we produce a journal with articles, peer-reviewed, and plenty of information for all. This particular iteration of what we're offering to the community is expanded beyond the AAEEBL family, and it's actually, this annual meeting is for everyone in the world. We've had people from Dublin and people from Egypt, people from Australia and New Zealand. So we're excited that we really are spanning the globe with this event. We wanted to respect the fact that these days it's really hard for working professionals to sit in an online conference for, let's say, 3 full days. And so instead we took the amount of content and spread it out over 4 weeks so that we can truly, for these 4 themes that you see on the slide now, doing it right, digital ethics where we are now, leveraging stakeholders from different parts of a campus and weaving things together. We wanted to move from Mondays to Fridays, moving from learning about topics to discussing them to putting them into action. So we really wanted to make this practical for people preparing for the fall. And so we hope today's session will add to that value by having discussions and answering your questions about what it means to do it right with respect to digital ethics and ePortfolios. And just as a side note, we do have an asynchronous pathway for people to participate in the AAEEBL virtual meeting, and that is through that Slack channel that you see on the bottom of the screen there.
Thank you so much, Kevin. So sorry, there's an airplane going over me here. All right, so one of the benefits of having a month-long opportunity to be able to engage in this work is that it gives us an opportunity to be able to try out some new things, sort of like cooking pasta and throwing it on the wall and seeing what sticks. And so one of the new ideas we're going to experiment with is Shark Tank ePortfolio Edition. And as I've been doing some researching, evidently in the UK as well as in Ireland, it's called Dragon's Den, which I sort of like better than Shark Tank. But I think Shark Tank is something that's also been used as a popular reality competition TV show down in Australia as well. So the ePortfolio edition of Shark Tank will certainly give all of you, and we want to invite all of you to actually consider pitching some sort of idea, an idea that could be a brand new idea for some iteration on portfolios on your campus or in your programs, or some kind of update or tweak or twist to something that you're already doing. This will involve basically one slide that will be sort of your pitch deck, and then also about a 3-minute pitch to some invited ePortfolio experts who will be our sharks. We are planning to have times that accommodate both the Europe as well as Australia. And so we'll be posting more information soon. In addition to getting some really fantastic advice and feedback from our colleagues, you'll also have a chance to win prizes. And that's just to kind of whet your appetite, but hopefully it's something you might consider doing. Again, it's really meant to be low-key, fun, an opportunity for you to begin to weave together the things that you've learned this week and really kind of come up with something new and different that you might like to try on your campus, as we're all looking forward to what will be a very atypical fall. So with that, I'd like to move on to give it back to Allison to talk a little bit more about the ePortfolios Australia, which has been such a tremendous partner for AAEEBL throughout the years.
Thank you, Helen. And so ePortfolios Australia is what I say is a true community practice. It actually started out of some funding about a decade ago. There was some funding around those days where there was some funding to run interesting projects, some in a higher ed capacity, some in what we call the vocational education and training, perhaps a bit more like your community college type environment. And when that funding fell away, we thought these projects would kind of fall away with them. However, there was a number of people who actually stepped up and said, actually, that we still want to do things. And so we've started to release or share with you through the link I've just given you there, some of the wonderful people who work in the background all year long to create a number of events. We have mainly we do our annual, bit like you, have a 2-day event this year. It will be starting as a fully online with maybe a component of having something face-to-face in Melbourne. But if you know anything about what's happening in Melbourne at the moment, that's probably highly unlikely at this stage in terms of our current situation. But over the years that we've run the forum, we run webinars, and this year we started a virtual workshop. We have 245 artifacts on our SlideShare that we've shared about ePortfolio practice, mainly through Australia and New Zealand, but some international stuff that people have been involved in as well. And then trying to bridge between those activities, we have a little Facebook group, and we would love people to join it. We've branded it ePortfolios Australia, but we do have people from around the world, and we'd just like to bridge kind of what's happening in between those activities. So thank you, Helen.
Great. All right, so just to give you some background on the history of this work, during the last year's annual meeting, there was identified by some of our members that there was a need for guiding principles to support the practice around digital ethics in the context of outward-facing portfolios. As a response to that, a community of inquiry was developed, and we're really thrilled to have some of the members from this digital ethics task force with us today to talk a little bit more about their experiences, in addition to well, actually, I think everyone here is actually from the task force. We're really representing the perspectives both from the North American perspective as well as the Australian perspective. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just briefly introduce our panelists, but of course they will speak more to their background and experience when they continue this discussion. So first of all, Megan Crowley-Watson is from Edward Waters College in Jacksonville, Florida. It is a historically black college and university, and there she is the director of the Writing Center and also involved in their accreditation efforts, the QEP. Dr. Megan Mize is from Old Dominion University. She is the Associate Director for ePortfolios and Digital Initiatives in the Center for High Impact Practices, does some tremendous work in terms of really engaging students and especially engaging students as collaborators around some of their ePortfolio initiatives. Now, Dr. Christine Slade is from the University of Queensland, where she is a senior lecturer at the Institute for Teaching and Learning Innovation, and has really been thinking about, writing about ePortfolios as well as digital ethics for many years. So we're thrilled to have her with us today. And Dr. Misty Kirby has just recently returned to the US from Australia, but really brings that perspective, from, both North America as well as Australia, and can speak to both contexts and so on. She was formerly an assistant professor in educational leadership and has been involved in academic development, really seeing the needs for some really focused effort and attention to these efforts. So again, we're so delighted to have all of you here today to share your background, your expertise, and your observations on this emerging field of digital ethics and ePortfolios. So with that, maybe I could go ahead and turn it over to Christine to really, again, add to this introduction and also share her perspective as well.
So hi, everybody. I just wanted to share with you how the Australian cohort got involved with digital ethics using ePortfolios, and we need to thank straight away Misty for actually leading this project. It was a research project which we have now completed, although some of the outputs are still running. But it was a concern that people within the ePortfolio Australia community had around secondary use of data. So when students put something in their ePortfolio for an assessment task, they're actually doing that within a closed environment. So the educators see that, mark that, whatever, or their facilitators. But when we're encouraging students to actually demonstrate their digital profile, looking for jobs, encouraging them to brand themselves digitally, we may omit to actually telling them that there's quite a number of digital ethics implications for doing that, and they don't understand necessarily the nuances that might be actually stated in guidelines for them. But there's so many different contexts to which that actually applies. And I think if any of you saw, I actually talked about that in my posing the question for this week, was about how can we help students actually understand all the different scenarios and implications of using vulnerable groups' data in other ways. So we've developed resources out of that. There's some guidelines. We recently at UQ just developed an e-professionalism module which starts to sort of unravel that. There's some resources there for you if you're more interested in that. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. So the first question that I'd like to introduce to get us launched is actually this question: what does doing it right look like when considering the digital ethics of ePortfolios for assessment? And maybe I could go ahead and start with Megan to talk a little bit about, again, her personal background and also her perspective on this, particularly from the context of her institutional perspective, as well as her other experience and work.
Great, thank you. Like you said in the introduction, I am from an HBCU in the state of Florida. We're a very tiny, under 1,000 enrollment, private college, hopefully universities, where we're trying to shift to next. And our program is only about 1.5 years old. And it was originally started as an administration handing me something and saying, sort of, make this happen, as I'm sure has happened with a number of people who are watching this today, or will happen to you soon. So when it comes to considering this question, I thought about a couple of different principles that we were developing, but the one that I wanted to just talk about real quickly is access to it. How, like, when it comes to assessment, as programmatic assessment, when your accreditation body comes to you and they want to see your artifacts, your proof of how you know your students have done well, how do you work this in? Where do you keep them? Where do you store them? And are they safely stored somewhere so that student information doesn't get out or hacked or seen by people that don't have a FERPA, at least in America, right to see them? So that's one of the things I thought we'd touch on.
Great. Thank you, Megan. So Megan Mize, maybe I could turn it over to you.
Yeah, let's do the Megans back to back. It's good. Hi, everyone. I am Megan Mize. I'm at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. I like to tell everyone when you hear about climate change, we're always right behind New Orleans because we're the one that floods second. So I am the Associate Director for ePortfolios and Digital Initiatives, but I'm also an English instructor. I actually came to ePortfolios as a graduate student tasked with flipping the English department to using portfolios, which I can tell you is no small feat. And then I was snagged by the Honors College to think about how they would use it, and then picked up at the university level, where I now have essentially a digital literacy studio under the guise of the EP initiative. So we work very closely with our writing center. We're a large university, about 26,000 students, have a large online contingent as well. So when thinking about how we might effectively and ethically evaluate learning via ePortfolios, I had kind of 3 quick bullet points I wanted to touch on in this question. Was first, I think it's really important to embrace a really egalitarian approach. Expectations and goals should be transparent. Evaluation should be formative from the jump, and it should be informed by a diversity of voices. At best, I think assessment and evaluation intervenes in the learning process, helps the student at opportune moments, identifies and celebrates strong student work, and allows for peer-to-peer modeling. The other thing I really wanted to stress here is that I think we really have to work with our colleagues to avoid the temptation that some of them have to reduce ePortfolios to kind of conspicuous data for programmatic use rather than student learning. Like that will sometimes get lost in the conversation, like, oh, this just looks so good for us in assessment. And it's like, right, but it's actually student learning first. And then that's actually great for assessment. And then the last thing I wanted to say in response to this is that we should really be thinking about life cycles of ePortfolios for evaluation. Freshman Megan Mize and Dr. Megan Mize look very different, but you shouldn't be able to look up a portfolio I generated 10 years ago that a program used to assess a decade ago and have that be representative of me now. So I would encourage us to think of some of those vectors in terms of ethical ePortfolio evaluation.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. I think it definitely relates to what Megan Crowley-Watson was talking about with respect to access. It just sort of goes right along with that. So Christine, would like to turn it back to you as well.
So I have a number of hats here. So I've actually been involved in the implementation of ePortfolios across a couple of universities, but I'm also the lead of assessment. And I think there's a lot of basic assessment principles which are ethical boundaries that we need to consider. And Megan just mentioned transparency, and both of them actually equitable. But there's quite a number of other ones like intellectual quality, alignment to the learning outcomes, all that sort of stuff we do in curriculum, how reliable and valid it is. So there are things that have been around for a long time that actually underpin good assessment, which should include ePortfolios. And as we find out for our next question, we've now got another one added, which is academic integrity. You know, is the student that actually submitted the assignment the one that should get the credit? You know, so we're juggling that a lot in Australia, and I'm sure that's come to you as well. So I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things and to say this is where we get the chance in assessment to do programmatic. So in Australia, program or course might be all of those subjects that the student does to make up their degree program. We don't use assessment so much for assessing the university, so it tends to be quite focused on student learning. But this idea of folio thinking and integrated assessment is a fantastic way to actually think about the program, think about all the things that you want the student to learn, and to be able to thread the ePortfolio mechanism and learning process through all of that. And as Megan said, that involves professional conversations with other people, and that also is a really great opportunity. So we should be, I think, making sure that when we're looking at all of those things, that we're not hiding things from the student. For example, often we write an assessment task, but it's actually sort of assuming that the student knows how to use the tool or knows how to access the tool. And we need, if we want to do that, we need to put in our criteria for the assessment task that that's one of the things. Otherwise, we're adding burden to them of trying to learn a new software or use something which is not actually assessed. I think that also goes with the point, and something we've learned from online this during COVID is that everyone raced to put assessment online, and the mindset was more about we've got to put this online. But really, online assessment, which is ePortfolios, is how long will it actually take the student to complete? How much effort would they have to put in? What does it require? So we need to be turning our thinking around to say, how long will it be for the student? What does this mean for the student? Because, you know, we could be piling lots of things on them. Also in that, just another couple of points would be, so we're always talking about authentic assessment, you know, well, authentic assessment in our mind tends to think exciting and all of these, you know, it's going to be complicated, it's going to be a lot of work, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. The thought that goes into it about what is that folio, what is that ePortfolio that the student needs is authentic, and you can actually sort of target high risk or high impact assessment tasks with that authenticity, so the student gets and an ePortfolio is just a fabulous tool for that. I guess part of that also too is that when you're online, it's engaging. So one of the challenges we've had is actually trying to engage the students online, but an ePortfolio sort of adds that continuity and sort of can be real world type things that can engage the student. But also because it goes on for longer and it's over a lot of number of sessions, the other thing is that students need generally to learn how to self-regulate themselves. So an ePortfolio can structure that over a period of time where they're learning to take more responsibility for what they actually have to do. I think the communication with students about what you're expecting, of course, that's an ethical decision, even though we might think that's just something we do that's operational, but it is actually ethical to tell the students how they're going to be marked, what your expectations are in the assessment task. And of course, you know, moderating marking is also ethical because we want to make sure that some students are not being marked at a different level to other students. And that feedback we give them too is a duty that we have to tell them how they can actually progress. So there's a lot of things that are in normal assessment that can be accentuated by using an ePortfolio.
Thank you, Christine. And then I'll go ahead and turn it over to Misty.
Thank you, Helen. And I really just will probably echo a few things that Megan, and Christine said. Really, this idea of doing it right in higher ed, I think Christine touched on the right idea. It does take a lot of time and it does take a lot of communication. I like what Megan said about this. We definitely need to take a broad approach. And I picked up on, she talked about peer-to-peer modeling and feedback. And those were some of the richest workshops that I had with my pre-service teacher education students at the University of Canberra in Australia. Being able to show them mine and having to pick it apart and being able to give critique and have those formative assessment opportunities. It's so important because ultimately doing it right really helps students understand the learning journey. And it's really about some of those bigger issues, like we'll talk about in a bit, academic integrity, research and scholarly work, and the purpose. Why do we bother doing this? What's the whole point? What are we on about? And really a philosophical understanding of academic integrity, that it's much deeper than I know APA or I'm an MLA guru. You know, it's not knowing where the full stop, where the period goes. And it's really understanding what the purpose of what we're doing is, and really highlighting, as Christine and Megan pointed out at first, this idea around digital equity, that we can't sort of just hide the fact that we're expecting a certain level of computer literacy and digital literacy from our students, but that we make it clear. And that it is, the metaphor I used with my students was, we're going to take a walk in a really big garden. And in your first year of teacher education, we're going to focus here on native flora and fauna. And then we're going to, in your second year, go to the Red Center. And then in your third year, we're going to go to the West Coast. And so it was a real journey of their learning about theory and practice and going into classrooms and practicing and really bringing it all around to this experience and research informing and improving who they are, so that yes, fourth year Misty looked nothing like, thankfully, first year pre-service teacher Misty.
Thank you all so much. I think, you know, I think for me, you know, hearing these multiple perspectives, obviously some of the issues, some of the challenges that that have been identified here are ones that are facing higher education writ large, you know, particularly around equity and access, transparency. How do we do it? We're all in this together. How do we do it together rather than having our usual typical silos and so on? It seems to me that there is, again, that emphasis on empathy for the student experiences, empathy for the, you know, who we're designing this for. It goes back to some, you know, some of the questions that I think that I had started with around in terms of why portfolios, why now? Those fundamental questions, like, you know, as we're looking for, you know, the different kinds of tools and strategies that we can employ to support our students and so on. ePortfolios are, of course, but one tool that is out there, one approach, one pedagogy, and so on. But there's certainly a lot to it has to offer, and a lot to be able to mine and explore. And I think we'll continue to do that, you know, not only in the rest of today's session, but also in the rest of our sessions, you know, throughout this month. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Patsy to lead us on our next discussion.
Thank you, Helen, and hi everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I might have to apologise in advance in case I drop out because of weird Wi-Fi connections at my place. But the next question really follows on from what we've just been discussing. And if I may, I'll ask this question and then I'll head back to each of the panelists to develop their thinking, and they're sharing their thinking a bit further with us. So the question asks, what does doing it right look like when considering the digital ethics of ePortfolios for assessments that promote academic integrity? So I might just start with Megan Mize, if that's okay, because Megan, you talked about the idea of life cycles and career progression and student learning. And in the May webinar, we talked about this concept of digital debris. So the idea of an evolving portfolio is very important for students. So how do we think about that in the context of promoting academic integrity and assessment?
Oh yeah, you had to make that question harder. I have thoughts, and I am talking in the side about the digital debris idea, and I do think in some ways that intersects with academic integrity. You know, I certainly have colleagues when they're first introduced to ePortfolios who are worried about the idea that a student might post the answer to this assignment in their portfolio and someone can look it up and they can cheat, and that's what portfolios will do. But I actually was going to kind of come at this and say, well, instead what portfolios, when evaluated ethically, and I really actively encourage departments that I work with to bring faculty into any assessment experience that's looking at portfolios before they start assigning them, because that's where they see the edges and they see the value of clarity of expectation. And sometimes the most compelling learning moment, I think. But I think ethical evaluation or assessment with portfolios is always an invitation to talk about assignment design. Can you design assignments that are so unique, are so scaffolded, are so metacognitive that students couldn't readily steal from another student's portfolio because they are so unique to the user, which is of course the idea of a portfolio. And so once we start doing that, I think we see the questions of academic integrity decrease, and the idea of that kind of digital debris where students are trailing behind them assignments that don't serve them. Instead, now it's watching a student reflect over time and kind of become more sophisticated over time. And then the other thing I was going to say, just in quick response, is that when we're having those conversations, we're also reinforcing this idea of peer review and peer feedback. And so students start to become kind of agents in the discussion of what is good, what is effective in the portfolio, rather than just us outside telling them after the fact, we think this is more effective. And so in this way, assessment becomes part of the learning process. They're invited in, and it really foregrounds relationship building, both from the faculty member and the students. I actually have employers sometimes work with students and give them feedback from the field. And the last thing I'll say is that for many of us who are working online or hybrid right now, it can also mean that evaluation leads to an increased sense of social presence because the students feel like they're talking to someone constantly about work they're producing, and it's meaningful. And it's not just a copy paste job at the end of the semester where someone says, great job, you got an A, see you later. You know, so I'll stop there, but I hope that kind of starts us in a nice spot.
Yes, thank you for that, Megan. So I might just pick up on the concepts of assessment and authentic assessment. Christine talked about this a little bit in her intro to the first and response to the first question. But Christine, I like the idea of intellectual quality and the alignment of student thinking and production of assessment tasks or responses to assessment tasks as a way of aligning their thinking and learning to the learning outcomes presented in coursework. So what I'm getting at is this authentic assessment and the high impact practice. I think it's very important to promote academic integrity. How would you go about thinking about this, Christine, when we're trying to promote this for students?
Well, at the University of Queensland and most other Australian universities, academic integrity is a very important priority at the moment. So we've had normal, traditional academic integrity or misconduct problems like plagiarism, collusion, whatever, but we now have been faced with the online contract cheating sites that use a lot of persuasive messages for our students to say, we can help you. And a lot of students have trouble deciphering those messages about good health and bad health. So there's a whole, and also our regulatory body also has asked us to hold, all of us to hold account to that. So we tend to take a whole institutional approach to that. So assessment design obviously is a very important part of that, but there are some other things that actually go with it as well. But so authentic assessment by itself doesn't actually lead to academic integrity, though I think it's more engaging for the student. And I wrote a paper for the Australian ePortfolios Forum back in 2017, which talks about the role of ePortfolios in academic integrity. So some of the things that we were discovering about the problems that students or the opportunity for them to get someone to buy an assignment or to get someone else to write it for them can be mitigated by an ePortfolio. And part of that, and I'll share the link to that paper because I actually haven't seen that many people write about this, but because if you're engaging students in class and you're giving them progressive work which they're comfortable knowing because we've explained to them what this is all about, it's more relaxing, it's not so stressful for them. And so therefore an ePortfolio has these regular points of submission and feedback. You can, like Megan said, you can have peers involved. It's good for group work, which has always got its traditional problems of what's happening in the group. It enables you to do engaging things like video and mix it all up, depending on what sort of software you've got. But you can use a lot of multimedia and stuff. So it's quite an engaging way to do it. From an institutional point of view, it's very helpful for academic integrity in the sense of we actually have a repository of students' assessment and work, which they've chosen to share with us. Right, not just there's private learning space where they put their own things, but these assessment tasks. So we can actually know those students better. We can know their level of academic ability, all those types of things. And that's useful for us to understand if something pops up that actually is quite odd for that student. We can have external facilitators actually verify by signing or giving feedback, timestamps, etc., that we know that's the student work, because all these tools can be available in an ePortfolio. You can see at any time that you want those assessment tasks from particular students. And so I think the knowing, research is telling us knowing of the students, in-class activities, reflective types of things are even little vivas and stuff like that are things that actually are difficult for students to cheat. So ePortfolios, I don't think we make enough of the fact that ePortfolios is a tool which a lot of us already have that can combat a lot of academic integrity problems.
Correct. So in designing authentic assessment tasks, one would hope that it's not only true to the discipline, but there is some integration of integrity and academic integrity as part of that. And teaching students along the way that this is the purpose of this task, not only to teach you what's true to discipline, but also understand integrity. So you talked about repositories, and I might just, repositories of information, go back to Megan Crowley-Watson and talk about that, Megan, if you could, because you talked about accreditation and possibly having repositories of ePortfolios that could be accessed one day. Can you talk about that a little bit further, please, in the context of this question?
Yeah, sure. Now, I know that a lot of institutions have their own ePortfolio platform built into the LMS. Moodle kind of does. It's not fantastic. I don't know if anyone's ever used the Moodle ePortfolio, like Exabis or whatever it is. So we actually use a third-party site that links in. It's Pathbright. Now, Pathbright has really great privacy compared to a lot of other ePortfolio platforms, but we have no control over it and no access to it outside of the link the student gives us when we ask for it, and they remember to do it. Right, so when it comes to assessment, I actually have them turn in a traditional Word document portfolio version so that we can keep to have on hand to prove we did in fact receive these assignments. And then additionally, they link into their ePortfolio. But right now I'm really still working out how to keep these as an artifact so that I can assign just the ePortfolio, because right now students really don't like me because I'm asking them to do double work.
Yeah,
So,
it often results in that, doesn't it? When you're trying to have the student keep their own repository or portfolio and then keep it at the institutional level as well, especially when links are asked to be shared. So it's a true consideration that you have there. Yep. So question now about, if I may, to Misty. You talked about the journey and going through various landscapes when you take your children, pardon me, your students through these journeys, these learning journeys. Is it also, do you teach a bit of the concept of looking back in terms of the reflective practice and what they may start to think about as they evolve as individuals and professionals as part of your teaching?
Yes, absolutely. Whenever I first began at Uni Canberra, I was probably one of the loudest detractors of ePortfolios. I'd gone to do training, and this was a version of Mahara from 2010, and I decided it was too hard. I didn't understand what these people were on about. And I furthermore just thought some of these rumors about them putting it all through as a requirement for all teacher education students was just going to be the straw to break the camel's back. Funnily enough, here I am. And one of the reasons I think that I am here is because of this process of being able to, at the ground level, to build in an embedded, integrated ePortfolio across the entire teacher education course for all early childhood, primary, elementary, and secondary students. And so they were able to see over the course of their course, just that learning and that journey. And we were big in a couple of my classes we actually held in schools. Students would go out, we would observe whatever it was that we were looking for out in those classrooms. We would come back and we would have those reflective moments, and those moments where reflection meets practice, and students are able to be able to change, because I have this odd definition of learning that it actually involves a change in your cognition, or in your affective, or in your behavior. So that is one of the most powerful pieces, is really looking at it as a learning journey, and looking and reflecting at those milestones. So for many students, it was, well, this was the milestone after I spent 3 months in a classroom working with small groups of children. And the most powerful experience, I think, was going back into their 4th year classes, which I had access to their portfolios, but I wasn't their teacher. And just to watch them go and reflect on the previous years, and to actually put theory to practice, which makes my little heart sing, and talk about different ways of working with students, and how, humane education, which is a soapbox of mine, and how they could really see working with students could benefit, and really tying it theory to practice, which I think my life mission is dispelling that it's a false tension. There is no tension between theory and practice, and for so many students, watching that light bulb go off and being able to sort of push back even on their, not too much, but on their cooperating teacher in the classroom, who said, oh, that theory stuff doesn't matter. And then to have my students say, well, this theory helped me understand this child better, and I was able to do this, which meets this particular standard because of this way. So it really encompasses, I think, all of that wonderful integration that really gets students understanding that this is a journey, and that it does change, and that they will change. And if they take this on and they're brave enough, because we talk a lot about bravery when we're doing our ePortfolios, if they're brave enough, that it will pay off, that they will see it, that they get really motivated. And from that, we did a lot of work. We put in ePortfolios across all of ACT schools for all teachers, and lots of things from then. But absolutely, seeing that growth over time and that praxis, that beautiful moment of that reflection is quite extraordinary.
Yeah. So it's really a powerful moment when you see that transition. I felt that too with the students that I'm teaching, and they start with thinking, I don't think I can do this, and by the end of it they're very comfortable, which is fantastic. So the ePortfolio, from what I'm extracting from this segment of the webinar, is really a powerful vector for change. Okay, for transformative thinking, for development of a student into a professional, for development of a teacher, as well as a person who can lead an individual into the next way of thinking. So I've been looking at the chat, and there's a lot of discussion about Pathbright portfolio and ways of supporting different platforms and so on. But if people want to go back to that and click on some of the links or talk to some of the panelists, please do. So I also picked up on something that Alison was talking about, students learning to curate information over time is very important as part of that portfolio praxis and folio thinking. So have any of you seen that over time where curation has improved? I might just quickly go back to Christine. Have you seen changes in student thinking and behaviours? Have you been able to track that over time at UQ, or is that something that can be done for the future?
I'm probably not the person on the ground to ask that, so Shari, you might like to put something in the chat. But ePortfolios, as in the word ePortfolio, and some sorts of concepts have been at UQ for a very long time. So we had bespoke systems, and a lot of the focus has been on work integrated learning. So in the professional degrees, I think that's where you can measure progress probably more clearly, more easily, because we have the things that I was talking about, you know, the reflection from themselves, but also having some sort of clinical facilitator or some sort of mentor outside can give them that, you know, that feedback. So I guess the growth in those courses or programs is quite structured, and they use the ePortfolio to actually, you know, record that and to encourage that learning. I think more of the challenge probably is around the degrees like science or humanities or things like that, where you have to create milestones perhaps. And I mean, that's an interesting conversation to have. What sort of things do we need to put in place or to think about that might be the types of things where we could measure that? I mean, it might be easy to do that as an individual student, and we get case studies and stories, but is there something that we can use to work to make sure that our students on the whole are actually, you know, progressing in their learning? I think that that might be an interesting question to pose.
Thank you. Would any other panelists like to add anything to that? No? Okay, so if I may, I might just give a bit of an overview of what we discussed today in this particular section. So the idea of accreditation by Megan Crowley-Watson, and having a repository, and also the idea of expectations and goals being transparent, as discussed by Megan Mize, and also the reduction to data. I like that idea of the portfolio being more than that. Actually, it's about student learning, and we discussed that quite a bit just now. And of course, Christine talking about the idea of the focus on folio thinking and learning, and again, how that comes back to authentic assessment and how that may be integrated within courses and programs. And Misty talking about the journeys that students take as they engage in ePortfolio praxis and their transition to, I guess, deeper thinkers and people who are ready to face the world once they graduate from university. So with that, I'd like to just round up this particular part of the webinar and then hand over to Kevin, if I may, for the next part.
Fantastic, thank you. And this is such a rich conversation, and I think the question that Allison posed in the chat might be something that we can cover in this area related to digital ethics as they pertain to equity. And I want to maybe frame it a little bit larger than just issues of access, but equity in a larger sense. And to kick that off, I want to share with everybody a definition that a group I've been working with in Peralta Community College District in Oakland, California, has been creating a working definition of equity, and they created a rubric to help instructors increase the learning equity in their learning environments. But if you look at the dictionary, the 3-word definition of equity, the shortest one is freedom from bias. And when we look at this expanded definition, Peralta and the equity team there said it's freedom from biases, assumptions, and institutional barriers that negatively impact students' motivation, opportunities, or achievement. And I think that really touches on a number of issues, including access. And so I want to start maybe by asking Christine, who in her first answer made allusions to equitable access to technology and other types of access. And Christine, do you want to expand on those and maybe even go beyond if you wish?
Okay. So our university is very large. It's got 53,000 students. It is one of the GO8 or the 8 sort of sandstone universities of Australia. And that brings with it, I think, its own assumptions. One is that our students have the money to buy their own laptops, have, you know, access to all sorts of technology. And you do see, you know, we have done the JISC digital, not just literacy, but digital survey, which asks students about hardware as well as other things of their own skills. And we have found out that we have a proportion of students who still have difficulty getting their own access. And I think COVID, you know, all of our stuff being online for the last semester has demonstrated, even with staff, that some of us have some very in and out type of internet connections. You know, you could be in the middle of something and it just drops out. So for students, you know, they might be, for example, you know, just having a very small plan, which they have to pay for that type of thing. They may have difficulty actually getting a laptop. So all of these things, I think we've been made a bit more aware of in recent times, and therefore we should respond. Now, I know that we have a few things we've put in place, like an equity scheme for students to be able to borrow a laptop from the library. During exams, if you had problem with your internet, there was actually spaces available on campus where you could actually come and do your exams so that you could be ensured of a good internet access. So I think we just probably here is slightly different to North America, but we need to be more, I think, aware that if we keep bringing students into the digital space, it might not just be socioeconomics. It might be literacy skills. It might be whatever. We need to come to grips with more of those access issues, because obviously if they can't do that for some reason, then they're already, you know, penalized in some of the things that we're asking them to do.
Absolutely. And Misty, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in your first answer as well, there was an implication there that we have to consider equity in their access to information and the training required to succeed with things like ePortfolios. And so that kind of dovetails right with what Christine just said. Do you want to build on that a little bit and add any other thoughts related to equity and digital ethics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of this comes out when I was doing my doctorate at William and Mary. I studied with Judy Harris and had a wonderful class of how to write a literature review. And I wrote my very first lit review on digital equity, and this was somewhere in the 2008, probably about 2008. And that and a lot of what I read about really stuck with me around not just ensuring that students have the actual materials that they need, but that they also understand how to approach the assignment. One of the things in my sort of culture shock when I moved to Australia from the US in 2010 and started teaching, you know, my big concerns, because I had a class of over 700 first years, welcome to Australia. My big concern was, okay, textbooks are expensive, coming from, you know, me spending lots of money, and so did my Australian counterparts. Textbooks are expensive. What is internet access like? The assessments were already set, a very exciting 2 essays. How can we set this up to be equitable? I just spent 10 years teaching high school English, so I was all over that. But really those issues of access, when I spoke with my Australian colleagues, I was sort of laughed at because, you know, it's the capital of Australia. We had brilliant internet access. There's no issues. And of course our students know how to do this, but not all of my students knew how to attach a document to an email. And that really floored me, because I had been convinced by my colleagues that my students were better on their computers than I was on mine. And that was just not the case. So it was really a lot of sort of steps back of thinking, okay, well, how much in my second semester, when I got to set my own assessments, how much of what I'm asking them to do and how much am I evaluating for their mark is dependent upon having access at any point to a computer, to an internet line, in a mixed mode class, when there is an expectation for so much online interaction. So I think it's things like those that we really have to think about. And that is even, I think, after we sort of even take a step back and we make sure that we feel comfortable with the technology ourselves, that we've gone through and that we've looked at the assessment. And Christine mentioned earlier about valid and reliable assessments, and that's one of my biggest concerns, and that's actually why that was the issue that took me into academic development and away from it, because of all of these invalid assessments. They were looking at other things, they were testing other things, and not necessarily the student's ability to analyze or critique an argument. So I think in that sense, ensuring that students understand what it is, what they're supposed to do, and peeling back, this is me coming as an English teacher, but peeling back those layers and really examining sort of some of those social structures and looking at what kind of information is being privileged and how we can sort of peel that back and make it accessible for all.
Fantastic. And one of the things that you said that brought something into the forefront for me, not all students may understand how to approach the assignment, which is not necessarily a technological issue at all. And if you, I'm not sure if they use the same phrase in Australia or Europe, but the concept of first generation students here is, you know, the students who are first in their family to go to college. they don't have the benefit of hearing stories of what it's like, or being able to have a resource at home where they
No, we
can
didn't.
ask. And so I think you're spot on with your statements about how much does their assessment score rely on those background knowledge things that we may assume that they have at their disposal, in addition to the institutional barriers of requiring things like internet, where even in big cities, we're seeing 23% of students don't have adequate internet. Over 20% of students don't have a reliable space to study, and maybe sharing a device with other family members as we all stay at home together, and adults have to work, other students have to learn, and so on. So there's an equity challenge in terms of how are we asking students to submit their work, and are we giving them multiple pathways, as universal design for learning might suggest. I want to turn my attention to the two Megans in the room, and in particular because I know we didn't get much chance to talk about the task force, but the task force that AAEEBL put together as part of that community of inquiry that Helen mentioned at the very, very beginning has been working for a year now almost on a set of principles related to digital ethics. And I'm interested, maybe we'll start with Megan Crowley-Watson. The work that you've been doing with that group, are there aspects of the digital ethics principles that you think really clarify or help illuminate equity issues that we need to be aware of, either as instructors or as administrators or as just humans?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm really glad I was able to be on the task force, because I felt like some of the point of view when it came to equity, access, and whatnot, I was able to add some troubling questions, like, well, what do you do if a student doesn't have a computer and literally can't access one? And those are difficult questions that we've certainly tried to address with the principals. This is one of the things I was actually thinking about when it came to assessment is your turn-in rate, right? If you have students that simply aren't turning anything in or aren't turning in the final assessment, you're not capturing them when it comes to your outcomes, right? You don't know what those students don't know. And so therefore that widens the gap. So our focus has really been to try to push up those turn-in rates by targeting the students that are not turning in and contacting them personally. What's going on? What do you need help with? What can I do for you, right? And I know that's not practical at every institution, especially like a giant one like ODU. But for us, it's certainly necessary and helps to, I think, it really improve the equity in our program.
Well, and I can say it takes effort, right? So I teach a fully online class with anywhere between 50 and 100 students. And I did make, over the last several years, a concerted effort to switch the language in my communications from more administrative deadline approaching to, which I thought might, get people motivated to, turn something in or something like that. And now my subject line is, are you okay? What do you need? How can I help? And I really respect that you are thinking along the same lines, but that what some people are calling warm demander, and I like the concept of gentle reminder, to send those individualized notes to as many as maybe 20 students a week can be tough, because they are juggling responsibilities that are beyond the academic front. They're managing their families, they're possibly working, and right now some are working double shifts as essential workers. And so Megan Mize, I'm going to give you the softball, of course, is like, how do we pull it all together? How do we keep, if I were an instructor preparing for the fall, what would you say are the biggest equity considerations I would want to consider when it comes to digital ethics and ePortfolios? There you go. The easy one.
Kevin, we got to talk about your softball definition. I'm gonna try, because I wanted to take a crack at this question and then the question about the principles and say, I think when we talk about the principles next, one of the things that was really important for us was not to just point at a thing and say, there's a problem with ePortfolios, but we want to say, there's a problem, and how can I deal with that at various levels at the university? If I'm an instructor in the classroom, how much authority or agency do I have here, or a student, or an admin? And so I want to give you one example related to this question, very connected to assessment and equitable access, and then 2 strategies I see for resolving it. And I think that mirrors what we did with the principles, and hopefully, and I also think this goes to that softball question of how do we bring it all together, right? So I'm going to tell you a little story because I'm an English person, an English instructor. So recently I had the opportunity to help a program assess or evaluate some ePortfolios, and I've helped them a number of times. And for the last 2 years, this incredibly diverse program with a huge representation from our population at the university has a very homogeneous evaluating team. And twice, they picked portfolios that shockingly looked very much like them. And it wasn't with any ill intent, but we heard a number of times things that I would even suggest are dog whistles, where people talked about, that doesn't look professional, or I didn't like that font or that picture or that color set, et cetera, and going on. And especially in America, but around the world, I think there's a really big need to talk about equity in a slightly different way. I'm glad Kevin opened that door. My argument here is I think there's a need to talk about equity and evaluation. All students have the right to be fairly evaluated by a diversity of raters. So, I mean, research shows as people gravitate towards the familiar, they privilege what might look similar to them, even if they don't realize that that taste or that subculture or whatever is floating in the background of that evaluation. So I'm sure we touch on that in our principles, but, you know, 2 things I see are actionable for that program, but could potentially be excavated for other programs to think about as well. And that's what we try to do with the principles is 1, to make sure that those folks who are looking at portfolios represent a diversity of experiences and identities, maybe even disciplines, because again, disciplines read things very differently, and they will look at ePortfolios and center on things very differently. You know, I'm always astonished when I think I have a really compelling ePortfolio example and someone from engineering hates it. You know, so I would say we need to look at who is evaluating and then have really explicit conversations prior to the evaluation, not just calibrating them on a rubric or standards, but to have a conversation about potential bias, taste, you know, all of those things to make sure that we're not just replicating systems based on preferences that we're not thinking about critically, because just as Megan said a minute ago, that then widens the gap. What happened was this program twice selected models that looked nothing like the majority of the program's students. And thus, it seems unattainable. You will never look like or be like these models that the program is claiming are the best. And so that's a problem and very demotivating in a program designed to actually motivate the very students they excluded. So, and the problem was they had 20 portfolios that were top contenders, and then really soggy definitions of what was the best. And so they got, you know, they got the kind of expected outcome. So anyway, I would then in our principles turn around and say, here's the scenario, here's some practical steps. And I really think we need to pay attention to that moving forward and have those conversations so that when we talk about portfolios being for the student and the university and the communal good, that they're actually holding up to that, and assessment is a part of that effort. Okay, Kevin, did I hit your softball? Is that okay?
Oh my God, home run. Or if we're in Australia and we're playing Highlight, then it would be, I don't know what it would be. I don't know the rules. But let's just say that you did well. Huh? And I think that you touched on some really important points, though, to be serious. And Allison earlier had asked a question in the chat, how can we help students move from feeling vulnerable about putting more of themselves into their assessment ePortfolio? And at a conference, when we were able to do those in person, I was talking to students of color who were concerned about putting their picture in their portfolio because they felt that it might unnecessarily bias employers. That they wouldn't look past the image to their qualifications, the work that they had done. And that's very real when you see the studies out of Stanford. Helen, her colleagues did a couple of years ago about just the bias in what we call interaction bias for discussion forums, where 94% of the instructors, regardless of what their background or culture was, responded first and sometimes only to names that look like white male names. And so how do we have those tough conversations that Megan Mize just described, where we are not just calibrating on these are the rubric criteria, but how are we making sure that we're having conversations about the potential biases, and then some of the assumptions that Christine and Misty brought up in the kind of instructions development of these assignments and assessments. Are we considering the pathways for students to have the same opportunities to submit their work? And it may be related to any number of things. In my own experience, I created a barrier for a student when I required students to turn things in with a PDF file. And one of my students was living in his car, and he was using his phone to take a class called How to Learn with Your Mobile Device. And he said, hey, come on now, how do I do this? And I totally took that rule and threw it out the window and said, hey, use a Google Doc, or if you feel safe parking your car in front of the library, there's a 24/7 computer lab. But even now, that's not possible with COVID. So we have to really think through, put ourselves in our student shoes and recognize that they're facing a lot of challenges. I realize that we are really rounding the bend here to close out the session. And so the final summary, I think, might be best for each panelist to take 1 minute to wrap up their comments. If you were on Twitter right now and typing up your summary of what you want to share with the world, because we are a global community right here represented in this space, then let's work our way alphabetically. So we'll start with Christine.
I guess my sentence would be, ePortfolios need to be thought of in a bigger perspective and linked to other areas. Networking like this, for example, and hearing other students broadens your understanding. I think we need more of that.
Brilliant. And then it looks like Megan Crowley-Watson alphabetically is next.
So through the lens of assessment, I would say to ensure authentic assessment, equitable access is necessary.
Didn't even need the full minute. Megan Mize.
Oh man, if this is the Twitter one, I would say to colleagues that evaluation with ePortfolios is not a neutral act, and when done well, it should be an act that helps the learner, and then maybe the program after that.
Nice perspective. And Misty.
Well, how do you follow that? Something along the lines of ePortfolios need to be viewed as a tool by all to guide lifelong learning. I think I'll just leave it there, because I think there's we've talked mostly today about the student use of it, but I've done work with academics and looking at their professional identity formation. So I think if we can look at ePortfolios as a tool for lifelong learning, I will leave it there.
Brilliant. And Patsy or Helen, do either of you want to add a 1 minute summary before we turn it over to Megan Crowley-Watson and Misty to talk about where we go from here?
I don't have anything specific. I mean, this has really been a terrific conversation, and we're hoping that we can continue some exploration of these ideas in Slack and also in future events going forward.
Thanks, Kevin. I might just reinforce the idea that ePortfolios are the vector for transformational change in terms of how we think, not only for our students, but also for us as instructors and teachers. So it really is a special way of developing yourself.
Great. Well, if we can advance the slide to the where to from here, then I will hand it over to Megan Crowley Watson and Misty to tell us how the rest of us can access resources and more.
Okay, so what's coming up still is the annual meeting. So you can certainly go to the, they'll be on the next slide, there'll be a link to the AAEEBL website where you can find out more about that. We will be releasing the 9 principles at some point, but I'm not sure exactly what date that is, but we'll certainly keep updating the Twitter and a bunch of other locations. So I would try Twitter and then the website for sure.
Absolutely. And then also there's one more week if you'd like to participate into what will be an online ePortfolio forum hosted by AAEEBL and ePortfolios Australia. It'll be the 29th through the 30th of October, and proposals are due on the 22nd. And these are always great spaces to meet with like minds. I'm really keen that it's online this year, as I'm not in Australia. And we'll be presenting on our project, and we'll be able to hear about ePortfolio practice in Australia, New Zealand, and beyond. And it provides such a wonderful space for rich opportunities and networking, and being able to sort of dig around and see how other disciplines and other fields and other places are implementing ePortfolios.
And can I get you to flip back to slide 17? Is that okay? So thank you, Misty, for doing that plug for our event later this year. So just another quick one. This one's in August. And probably in the thick of your summer holidays and not interested. The other part of it is it's probably in the middle of the night. But what we do encourage you, sorry, if you're in the northern